So we have every interest in coming to grips with these uncomfortable truths. And I have been fighting this cause since the 1970s, since I was a very young man. And I have seen many massacres, even larger than the one which took place in Gaza. I have visited the scenes of death and destruction, still smoking, the dead still smelling from under the masonry. Let me just give you one example. It's the example of the refugee camp at Jenin, which those of you who follow these things will know is the place that's used by Israel to justify the building of its apartheid wall across Palestinian land in the West Bank. Because so many fighters and suicide bombers have emerged from this camp. Let me tell you one or two things that may just explain how people feel in that camp. It's 1 square kilometer, it's tiny. 13,000 families live in it. It's a rancid, rat-infested hovel in which refugees have lived for 60 years. I visited it with my friend Ron Mackay, who's with me this evening, hours after the ending of the Israeli massacre led by Shawn in that camp 5 years or so ago. It was my first visit to that camp. They took me on to the roofs that were still standing, and they pointed to a shining city on the sea, on the horizon, called Haifa. And they explained that virtually every single refugee in Jenin camp is a refugee from Haifa. Can you imagine 60 years of living in a rat-infested refugee camp and actually being able to see your own house, your own garden, your own orange tree being enjoyed, being lived in by people who came from Brooklyn? Benjamin Netanyahu will not be banned from Canada. If he arrives there, he'll be given the same red carpet that Ariel Sharon, the butcher of so many Palestinians and other Israeli leaders, have been greeted with. And that's what's driving everyone crazy, you see. This double standard. Iraq was broken on the wheel of the demand for the implementation of the United Nations resolutions. Even though, as it turned out, she was not in breach of any. While Israel has broken more UN resolutions than all the countries of the world put together, and escaped scores of them by US veto in the Security Council. She's never punished, she's endlessly rewarded, and the people get angrier and angrier. So what is to be done? Well, if there's no justice, there's no peace. You don't have to be Einstein to work that out. You can't say you're for peace, but you're not prepared to pay the price, which is justice. This was the stand of the Boer European settlers in South Africa over decades during the apartheid era. They always said they wanted peace with their black neighbors, but they weren't ready to pay the price, which was equality with their black neighbors. And so their protestations of peace were meaningless. As the poem said earlier, there are people who support peace and justice in Israel, but their numbers are small and getting smaller. The response of the Israeli electorate to the 22-day crime on Gaza was to elect a government even more extreme, even more aggressive than the government which had conducted that war. When they voted for Netanyahu and Lieberman, they were voting for war. And this is where you come in, because they can't have war unless you pay for it. The only way they can have a policy of unending war and aggression against the Palestinians is if you continue to agree to pay for it. If you tell them to stop, they must stop, for they are nothing without you. I have to keep coming back to you, because we can't leave this to Israel. It would be like a surgeon operating on his own foot. He will not do it. He will not be able to do it. Israel cannot stop what it's doing, because the whole edifice is built on a lie which can now never be untold. That lie is that Palestine was a land without people, that they were a people without a land, and here was an empty land with no people. But there are hundreds of people in this room and millions over there who are living testimony to the fact that the Palestinian people did exist, does exist, and will continue to exist and demand its rights. Its right to return to its country, the land from which it was driven, the houses which were taken from them. So Israel cannot undo that lie. Only you can force a settlement of this dispute. And if you don't, I say this with all respect to President Obama, if you don't change America's policy towards this question, there's no point in closing Guantanamo Bay, because you'll have to reopen it. In fact, you'll have to open 100 Guantanamo Bays, because it's your policy towards this question which is recruiting the fanaticism which Guantanamo Bay has tried and failed to deal with. What is the solution? Well, there are two. One of which has the benefit of being the just and democratic option. We can have two states on this tiny piece of land, smaller than the Kruger National Park in South Africa. We can knock down every Zionist settlement in the West Bank. We can dismantle brick by brick the apartheid wall. We can build a flyover from the West Bank to Gaza, so that we can have a Palestinian mini-state on 22% of what was once all Palestine. We can tell the millions of refugees, some of them here, that they can never return and that their rights will never be implemented, which will be, I promise you, a guarantee of continued enmity and hatred, not least from those who've been told by such an agreement that they can never go home. Or we can do the right thing. We can have one state from the river to the sea in which Jews, Muslims and Christians can live as equal citizens before the law, with every man and every woman having one vote to elect one government, which would be the only democratic government in the entire region of the Middle East. Wouldn't that be better than what we have now, or what the two-state solution